Alright, so a few weeks back I released my video about the state of HSR, which I decided to make because I wasn't really feeling much desire to play through the 3.1 story. While I'm mostly happy with the direction that video went, I don't think I really covered my feelings about the story itself as well as I'd have liked to. As a result, since then I've been thinking more about the Amphorius story in HSR and also why I feel a little bit dissatisfied with it apart from what I discussed in that previous video. So here, I want to just talk about why I feel that dissatisfaction with the current HSR story, how it compares to my feelings about how the story used to be, and some general thoughts about how the game has changed around the new storytelling methods. Keep in mind, these are all just my opinions. Everyone will feel differently about the story in the game, so if you disagree with what I say, that's fine. All this stuff is subjective anyway. So with that said, let's get into it. First, I want to talk about the actual scope of the stories we're playing. So to start, I think it's best to discuss how the storytelling has changed over time. Like, when I look back on the previous arcs in the game, specifically the Herta Space Station, Belobog, and the Luofu, for the most part, I felt that it followed a more traditional type of storytelling. And to explain that point a bit further, by traditional storytelling, I'm mostly talking about how each of those stories all felt focused and grounded in terms of what we as the players could interact with. Right? Like, they all actually did have large plots in terms of scale, but all we as the players had to be concerned about was what was immediately affecting us as the playable main character. For example, if you look at the Herta Space Station story in a broad sense, the station got attacked by the Antimatter Legion, which directly relates to an Aeon, or basically a godlike being. But us as the players don't really need to worry about that godlike being right then and there, because our goal is to just survive that attack and make sure that the space station doesn't get destroyed by the giant space dragon that was attacking it. We could also look at the Luofu, where there's actually a couple different Aeons involved and a greater plot where the Aeon of the Hunt, Lan, is constantly at war with the Aeon of the Abundance, Yaoshu. But again, us as the players don't have to be directly concerned with those Aeons, just something simpler like how we can help the Luofu get through their current struggles with the Aeon's minions. And lastly, which I'd say is my personal favorite, we can take a look at Belobog, where it was an extremely contained story almost entirely focused on just that one planet and how the people on it were simply trying to find their way and survive, even if the way they chose wasn't the right one as seen with Kekolia. Despite Belobog being the most prominent example, honestly I feel all three of them were relatively contained and didn't feel like they were trying to do too much. We didn't have 20 different characters all with different motivations doing completely different things. Instead, it was just a small core cast all working together towards a common goal. Like, they felt traditional in the sense that we didn't have to worry about some massive problem that affects everything we know in the universe, and instead it felt like we were on an adventure and these locations were just stops on it. And since those early stories, personally I feel HSR has strayed too far away from what made them feel the way they did, because they no longer focus on an actual concise and direct plot. What they've been doing since has been a weird mix of stuff that's either super broad in scope like Penacony with its tons upon tons of different factions, or stuff that's extremely focused on specific characters like Amphorius, with each patch seemingly focusing on a different Chrysos heir and their individual stories. To me, it feels like I've lost that sense of each HSR story being about our journey as trailblazers across the stars along Akivli's rail, because now each story feels bigger than it should be. Like, think of all the different plotlines in Penacony that got left behind to the point that the devs themselves feel that we need to go back in 3.8 to finish them. Think of how much longer we're going to be on Amphorius, because supposedly we'll be here until we actually go back to Penacony in 3.8. The newer stories that we're playing through are getting much broader in scope and also a hell of a lot more complex, and personally I feel that's where my enjoyment has started to slightly wane with them. And to be clear, I'm not saying that every story needs to be concise and simple, right? Like, having a broader world is normal, that's just world building. Where my problem lies is when the story we're currently playing through feels larger than life, in the sense that it almost feels like each arc could have been its own game. And I think a decent comparison point here would actually be Genshin Impact, Hoyo's other game. While the main overarching story to find our twin has progressed at a snail's pace, for the most part they've made every region we've gone to in that game feel like a stop rather than the destination. Right, like, we go to each new region to find information on our twin, but usually what happens is we get involved in whatever drama is going on in that region. We then solve that drama, get some information not necessarily related to our twin, but usually related to the larger picture of the world, and then we move on to the next and repeat that process. Personally, I feel that HSR used to be like that as well, but let's be honest for a moment here, can we really say the same anymore? Like, when we left Penacony, did it really feel like the end of a story considering all the plot holes that were left behind? Now that we're on Amphorius, do you really see a way where we can somehow leave this planet anytime soon? For me, that answer is undoubtedly a hard
no.
and I don't really feel like that leaves me as a player with a feeling of content as we move on to new areas. Honestly, I feel like Hoyo is kind of bit off way more than they can chew with these recent stories, and that's a large part of why I feel dissatisfied playing through them. As the story gets broader in scope, it becomes a lot more difficult to care about the smaller parts of it. Like, it's no longer about a character like Bronya coming to terms with her adoptive mother going crazy by using a Stellaron to try to save their planet. It's no longer about just trying to save one ship of the Zhanzhou fleet from destruction. We have moved so far beyond all the simple stuff at this point to where now we've done stuff like literally stopping Sunday from reviving a dead Aeon in Penacony, who, reminder here, was one of those godlike beings that we were fighting only the minions of just a year prior. The stakes have gotten extremely high at this point, which actually brings me to another thing I wanted to talk about here, and that's how our playable character, whether that's Stell or Kalis, interact with those higher stakes. Pretty much ever since the game launched, there's always been some level of the Trailblazer being, for lack of a better term, a gremlin, or I guess as the community refers to them, a trash panda given their obsession with it since Belobog. Despite that, they would usually give us a variety of options during dialogue to choose from as we progress the story. At the beginning of the game, usually there would be a more serious option, a middle-of-the-road option, and lastly an unserious option that would be more of a joke. As time has gone on though, I feel that somewhere along the way, Hoyo decided to go all in on the main character being a gremlin, because now they're trending towards always trying to fit in jokes and memes as responses, even when it doesn't necessarily fit the tone of what is going on in the story. Like, it's gotten to the point where sometimes there's actually no option to choose that isn't a joke, as seen with a screenshot like this from the Emphoria's story. To be clear, I'm not trying to say that I want these meme responses to go away, because honestly, I feel at this point they're part of the main character's identity. But being a part of their identity doesn't mean it should be their whole identity, and that's where I'm kind of having an issue with how they've been developed over time. Like, I have to be honest, it really takes me out of the story when we're at a part of it where the dialogue shouldn't really be funny, yet the only options I have to choose from are the joke ones. I think the worst one for me was back in the 3.0 story where we were getting world building from the fountain in Okema. In that scene, there's a bath sprite that gives narration and explains how the world came to be, the gods in it, and some other things, and at least for me, that could have been where I started to get invested in the Emphoria's world. Instead of letting that play out though, no matter what dialogue options you choose, Aglaia will butt in, and then the only available responses from that point will make the bath sprite change voices to a more Paimon-esque voice that, according to Hoyoverse, is a style that we as the playable character prefers. And for me, this was awful. I was starting to get into the world of Emphorius with that narration that gave some backstory as to what happened before we got there, and then they literally rip it from your hands and force you to listen to a Paimon-type voice telling you everything you just heard in a more simplistic, and by Hoyoverse's own line, childish manner. I can't be the only one that's thinking this, right? Like, it doesn't matter how good your story is, because if you treat your player like a moron, then what incentive would they have to actually get invested into it? All I really want is to go back to a world where the Trailblazers' choices didn't always feel like a joke. As I said earlier, the stakes have gotten much higher, yet the main character almost feels like they've devolved in the opposite direction as time has gone on. As a player, it doesn't feel great to see, and I guess hopefully in the future it can be changed or at least dialed back a little bit. Something else that I wanted to talk about that I've kind of been getting more annoyed by as time has gone on is something that we haven't seen since 2.4, and that's companion quests. Most of the time, these were used to give proper backstory on characters. For example, we learned about Yukong's daughter and their relationship and hers, why Yunli was so adamant about collecting different curse swords in hers, and even got some lore about the potentially dead Aeon Adrilla through Argenti's quest. These are all cool bits of lore that actually develop characters beyond what they got in the main story, or didn't in the case of characters like Argenti, yet ever since 2.4 we haven't seen a single one. To be clear, I do recognize why they probably stopped doing them, because in 2.1 they realized the success of Aventurine being the main focus allowed them to bring in characters into the main story instead of having to do something separate for them. That's something that has continued all the way till present times, where we've got characters like Maide and Tribi being the massive focus in 3.1 and Castoris and Anaxa taking the focus in 3.2. For me though, I just don't know if it's something I'm really vibing with, because in my eyes the characters are losing personality through this storytelling method. To explain a bit, think back to the Yunli companion quest. Whether or not you completed it and learned why she's so obsessive over the cursed swords doesn't necessarily matter to the main story in 2.4 and 2.5. You don't really need to know her motivations to understand, alright, they're cursed swords, I'm sure she has a reason for it. But for those that do care, all of that lore is there in a 1.5 hour companion mission if you want it. It's optional, but it does still have importance to the character herself if you want to go and find out more about her. Now on the other hand, if you take a look at the current story going on in Emphorius, think about Maide. His portion of the 3.1 main quest is basically what we got instead of a companion mission, and during his section you got to see him being a badass and eventually ascending to become the demigod of strife. That section of the story was extremely important to what was going on in the world itself, because it was a capstone on the 3.0 story where we actually collected the core flame of strife, and it also helped progress the story as it gave the rest of the team time to figure out their next steps going forward while he fought the Black Tide. But if you think about it, that story wasn't really about Maide, right? Like, he was the focus, but in terms of his character, I personally don't feel like we really learned enough about him specifically for it to be equivalent to what we used to get for characters in stuff like companion quests. To me, it feels like Maide was used as a plot device to further the main story because you really can't separate the two. If Maide doesn't accept the core flame of strife, there's no way for the story to progress further, so all of that badassery and his ascension to godhood was never really about him, it was about the action that he completed. That's not to say we didn't get some development for Maide there, but what I'm basically arguing is that it wasn't enough. And it's not just him, to be clear, this has been going on for quite a while. We can actually look back at 2.6 with the Rappa quest for another example. We got some of her backstory when we learned that she was basically grown in a lab and then managed to escape, but all of that backstory was just there to justify Dr. Primitive being involved at the Penacony Academy. The 2.6 story wasn't really about Rappa, it was just tacked on so that the story could have a villain. While telling stories like this is fine in a vacuum, personally I feel it loses the aspect of really getting to know the characters that we collect. When characters are used as a plot device, there's not really any room to explore other avenues with that character, because once their part of the plot is done, they basically serve their purpose and there's no reason to ever see them again. On top of that, it leaves some characters in a spot where they have to be shoehorned into the story to remain relevant, and that creates scenarios like we saw back in 3.0 with the Herta side quest at the end of the main story, and going even further back, both Sunday and Fugue's story in 2.7. To me, this is all kind of frustrating because this game already struggles with keeping characters relevant in the story once their arc is done. For example, we haven't seen some of the older characters like those from Belobog in over a year at this point, and I feel continuing to release companion missions would have been a great avenue for those older characters to remain relevant, even if they already had one in the past. To go full circle here, one last thing I feel I need to mention is that making character stories part of the main story really goes back to what I said earlier. The game no longer feels like it's about our journey through the stars. To me, it feels as if the Trailblazer has almost fully taken the back seat, especially compared to how the game was sold early on with the Belobog storyline. Like, we're no longer the badass blessed by aeons that can fight against a Stellaron-infused villain with the Wildfire song playing behind us. We're no longer the aide to our companion Dan Heng fighting against an emanator of destruction to save our friend Jing Ron. We're no longer on our journey, and instead we're stuck in big overarching plots that feel way too large in comparison to how they were not that long ago, which to me feels completely antithetical to the point of the game. The idea of the game was us exploring the universe, helping where we can by doing what we can, and relaying the silver rail of Akivli, but I feel like that vision has been entirely lost. I want to bring you all back to the literal first step that we took after we all told Himiko that we wanted to join the Astral Express in the very first version of the game. A song started playing, and it's one that I haven't forgotten since then, and honestly, I'm sure you haven't either. It shows that we're going on a journey not just for ourselves, but with a group of companions, one that very quickly became a family. It carried one message, and that was to come with me, take the journey. Since the song was released, over time I feel that the message of it has been lost and the game is no longer what it set out to be. I really miss when the game felt like it was about our journey with our companions. I miss when our playable character didn't feel like the butt of the joke all the time. I miss when things felt more real and less like Hoyo was trying to push the latest hot new character onto us through the story and instead just told the story as it should be told. Somewhere along the line, I feel that Hoyo lost their way, and as I've realized that, that's where I feel my dissatisfaction with it has come from. While I don't really think that all this stuff is possible to change during Amphorius, I feel going forward beyond it, the game would have a much better story if it went back to the more traditional route of following a grounded plotline that we as the playable character can directly interact with. Hopefully in the future, we can see some improvements here, but realistically, only time will tell. Anyway, that's just all my thoughts, and you're more than welcome to disagree with them, because as I said at the beginning of this video, this is all subjective. If you have some thoughts of your own, I'd love to hear about it, so feel free to join my Discord link down in the description to talk with me about it. As usual, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give the videos a shot too. I'll be waiting till we